Hey everyone, welcome back. We've been writing a lot of Python code and learned to use functions for efficiency. By the end of this video, you'll know how to import and use libraries in Python. There's a similar abstraction called a library or package. A Python library is simply a set of code that has already been written. This set of code can be imported and then used by you. This library's code could have been written by you or others. Having a library to share makes it much easier to use code-like functions that have already been written in your code. Let's take a closer look at loading a library in our own notebooks. We're now in a new notebook where we can write our own Python code, including importing libraries. Now, typically you'll be importing libraries that others have written. We can also import libraries you've made, though we won't do that in this course. Comment if you need a video about how to build your own library in Python. If you were to use a third-party library, you'll normally have to install it. But there are also libraries that are built into Python, so we'll start with those libraries. The syntax for importing a library is quite easy. You start with writing import and then the name of the library. In this case, we're actually going to import the built-in library called collections. This will give us more tools for data structures. If I go ahead and hit Shift-Enter here, I've now imported the library and now I have a new seller work in. Note that although you can technically write import statements anywhere in your code, the convention is typically to write all the imports at the top of our notebook. This is useful because we can import multiple libraries. For example, I can also import the built-in datetime library by listing it below. I can do that, import datetime. This now will import not just the collections library, but also the datetime library. But let's get back to the collections library. There are multiple different tools in the collections library. We can use these tools by first typing collections followed by a full stop, and then the name of the function or other Python object. Now we can also see a set of suggested objects by hitting tab after the full stop. You can see here, for example, there's ABC, chain map, order dict, and a whole bunch of other ones. For a concrete example here, we'll use the collections default dict. This is a function that will create a data structure similar to a dictionary. The difference is that we can create the default dictionary and then pass in a function that will be used as the default if a key doesn't exist. Let's go ahead and try this out. For example, we can pass in the built-in function list for default dict. I'll go ahead and put a parentheses list here, and that will be used for default dict. I'll also go ahead and assign this to a variable. We'll call this just simply D. I'll go do Control Enter here. Control Enter is like Shift Enter. You can use either to run a cell. Now I have this dictionary D, and I can add new keys and values into this default dictionary, as well as retrieve values from the dictionary. Let's go ahead and do that first. We'll go ahead and add in new values in here by doing D, and then typically how we would do with a dictionary, we have a square brackets, and then we'll enter key. This key, I will just call it a key. I'll put an underscore underneath there to make it easier to read, and then equals to 1, simple enough to retrieve that value. I can go ahead and do D and then dot an underscore key, and we can see we get our value back 1. However, with the default dictionary, I can also attempt to get a non-existing value associated with the key, and instead of an error, I'll actually get an empty list. Let's go ahead and do that. This time I'll get a key that, again, doesn't exist in the default dictionary. For example, I'll just do the letter B. You can see here we get returned an empty list. You can see this can be very useful for us. Note that every time I want to use a tool like default dict, I have to write out the full line. This can be quite cumbersome. There are methods in importing libraries and their tools to make things easier. A way we can do this is giving the library an alias. Instead of writing import collections like we did before, we can do import collections and then as an alias. In this case, I'll just use the letter C. In this case, when I run this code, I can use the collections library using the alias C instead of collections. Default dict. Let's go ahead and do a kernel restart. In fact, I'll go ahead and restart so we get rid of all the outputs. Just so it's really easy for us to understand that this is new stuff that we're putting in. Now I'm going to go ahead and run this fresh. Again, when I run this, I see collections as C. Now, instead of doing D equals collections, I can just do C.defaultDict and then have that same thing. We can see we have the same thing where I do Shift Enter, Shift, Enter, and Shift, Enter. Note that I can also still do C dot and then do the tab, and I can see I get these suggested actions I can do for the collections library. Now, one thing you should know is that we can't use the collections like before. For example, if I tried doing collections.defaultdict, you see we can error because we didn't import collections, we actually imported it as C. Just know that once you make that alias, you'll have to keep using that alias for the rest of the notebook. Now, sometimes we only need a few or even just one tool from the library. In that case, we can use the from import syntax. I'll go ahead and go back up here to a kernel restart and clear output and show you how we do this. The way we write this, instead of saying import collections as C or import collections, we can do from collections import and then have the specific tool that we want from collections. In this case, we just want a default dict. Then I'll go ahead and delete this line since we don't need that anymore. Now we can go ahead and run this line. We can actually use default dict directly. Instead of doing a C dot or collections dot, I can just do default dict, and sure enough, we get results that we had before. There's even a shortcut to import all objects from the library. We can do that instead of doing from collections import, like the specific tool we want. We can actually use the star icon here. Usually, people read this as from collections import star. However, this is generally seen as bad practice because it is difficult to keep track of what was actually imported. Again, doing a kernel restart here, and I'm clearing out the output you see when we run this. We now have default dict available for us to use. We've seen how we can import specific objects, and it can make things more concise. But it should be done carefully and arguably sparingly, because sometimes different libraries will use the same name. If you happen to import objects with the same name, only the last to be imported will be kept. One way to avoid this is to actually use as to create an alias for a specific imported object. The way we do that, we have our from collections, our library import, and then the tool we want. In this case, let's say we call it default dict. That's what we care about using. Then we can use the as to get an alias for default dict. In this case, I'll put ddict. Now, when I go ahead and run this code, it now imported just default dict. But instead of using default dict, as you see, now we have our ddict here. We go ahead. When we try to run this, you'll notice that we'll get an error now because we haven't defined default dict. Instead, we have our new alias ddict. This way, if there was another, for example, import that we did where default dict was defined, we can still use the default dict from collections. But using a new alias, you might be asking what's the best way to import? As with most things in life, it depends on the situation. However, it's typically considered best practice to be more descriptive without making things too cumbersome. Generally, if you're using many tools from a library, you can import the full library, possibly with an alias, especially if it's a commonly used alias. After that, importing specific tools, possibly using an alias is good too, specifically if the name of the object is unlikely to interfere. Lastly, using the star import is generally avoided, although there are cases where it might be used, though I personally rarely use this kind of import. This concludes our introduction to libraries. It's good to go over these conventions first, so as we introduce and use libraries in this course, you'll understand why the code was written the way it was. We'll soon be importing and using the NumPy libraries. We'll be seeing a lot of the NumPy library in the upcoming video. Don't forget to smash that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell to stay updated. New videos are consistently being released. Thanks for watching, and see you soon.